Welcome to the Smart Property Investment Show, the podcast by investors for investors.
Oh, g'day, how you going? Phil Tarrant. Tarrant. Someone go, do you know where that, you know exactly where that's from?
Tarrant.
Terrence. You know what? I've been watching South Park recently.
No.
Yeah. It's just because it was always hard to get it come onto my feed on the Netflix, and I went, I'll watch a bit of that. And I always watch it. I like watching a show before. It's so well observed and current because they reckon it only takes them a day to create one of these episodes,
Really?
right?
They're just immediate.
They're just on it. So anything happens, pop culture or
Got to
US
get it out
president election, they get out
Yeah.
straight away.
Makes
And
sense.
They just get it right. They're current.
Unlike you haven't been current for decades.
I'd say I was right on message at the moment.
Evergreen.
Ralph Lauren shirt, fancy pair of jeans, good pair of hoofs.
Nice one.
But being current is important in property, Paul.
Yeah, that's
It is
very
probably
true.
important. And,
Nice one.
You see what I did there?
I
It's
do.
Pretty good.
I observed.
And for our listeners and viewers here, I copied a neck a fair bit from Paul Glossop. He's always moaning and complaining, telling me how good he is, particularly when it comes to pricking properties. And he's been going, the Fast 50, geez, we picked that well. And I'm happy to point out that and the brains and the genius behind that report and the skill is trying to find people who can contribute to it. And fortunately with the Fast 50, which you would all know of, and you can download it from smartpropertyinvestment.com.au, where to put your money today for the best capital growth in 2025. We do this every year. It's the second year we've done this. Paul wanted me to get him on a podcast so he could say, I told you so. And I said, well, I don't know how comfortable I am about that. So let's have a discussion. Let's talk about it. But here we are, 6 months on since we launched a report, February, late-ish February.
Yep.
This year, 24, we're now in July, so that's 6 months on. We thought we'd regroup, get our scorecard out and just see how we're tracking. Now, there's 50 suburbs in this report, and you can go and tune into a series of podcasts we did when we launched it, where we break down every single bit of it. We give some sense and science to it all, performance of different assets. And I reiterate, this is houses only. We don't look at units. The idea of this report is for us to hopefully help telegraph where you should be putting your dough for the purpose of capital growth, immediate capital growth, and hopefully you would expect long-term capital growth. But already you're seeing 2 reports in. Certain suburbs made the list in 24. They didn't make it in 25. So they're on the wane and maybe still good investment spots, but not necessarily the right spot for you to be investing today. So, Paul, I just wanted to grab you for half an hour or so. I'll probably extend on beyond that, just to go through how is performance tracking on the Fast 50. And, you were one of a number of different and key contributors we had to this report. And what this very much is an aggregation of the brightest minds in real estate in Australia to give this their predictions on the performance of markets right across Australia into the year ahead. What we do at Momentum is that we look at the commonality of those recommendations and then we overlay data with it, quarterly growth, average annual growth, 12-month growth, and also we apply some rental yields. We have Paul, obviously, from Pure Property is our partner of the report, and we met on your podcast recently, Lena Lindley. She was one of the experts we had on this report, but we also have people like Margaret Lomas, who many people would know from her time on Sky TV. She's director at My Property Match. You've got people like John McGrath, CEO and executive director of McGrath Real Estate Agents, people like Arjun Paliwal, who we know, another very good buyer's agent out there, plus people from Stockdale and Lego, the executive chairman of Raynor Horn, Angus Rain. So a really good cohort of people who all provided their recommendations. I'm even on the list. Surprise. Wow, who would have thought?
Who'd have thunk
it? I think they just did that because I just look at it here. They wouldn't have been neat.
Symmetry.
It's 3 across
Just
and 4 down.
symmetry.
So I'm happy to play my role with just keeping things asymmetric. That's typically what I do. But thank you again to you and your team for your contribution and participation in this. And when we broke down, when we're getting ready to launch the 2025 report, we actually looked at how we performed in 24 and we got it pretty right. And sort of some of the numbers we'll go through today will probably highlight and indicate that so far, particularly the recommendations you've made, I think you're probably going to tell me they're not bad recommendations.
Well, these are good podcasts, Phil, because a lot of the things we talk about in property are their theories, their thought bubbles, their sometimes experience, but a lot of the time they're not necessarily backed up to that day with data. And property is something that we always talk about. It really should be approached as a long-term play. And, we're talking about short-term data here. And in property, anything you're talking about 6 months, 12 months, 18, 24 months even, that's short-term in property. This isn't long-term data we're talking about. But it is nice.
That's an important point, right?
Correct.
Like, this is we've got to be careful with this because and by way of a disclaimer, it's not like a legal disclaimer, but this is a common sense disclaimer. What we're talking about is a moment in time.
Correct.
You should not be setting your investment objectives and strategy around 1 year of potential capital growth.
Yep.
That's absolute folly. So
I don't.
Yeah, I don't. Best investors I know
either.
don't,
No.
right? So we've got to make sure we give sense to. This is a sense for how you can accelerate capital growth by investing correctly, and I'd like to think most of these properties would have a longer tail of growth than 12 months because these aren't mining towns, which you might just get a blip and it just accelerates. You might get 500% in some place, right?
Yeah.
Like that's not what that is. But this is really just it's a guide to give you a sense for how where you deploy your money will matter.
Yeah.
Depending on the strategies that you have.
Correct. And if you're looking to try and find your way to expedite your first investment or your 10th investment to then use that investment to catapult you to extract equity and do something else with it, that's the intention of this is where do we expect based on the data? And I guess going back to the remit of how this is put together, obviously we provided our recommendations, and I think from memory we provided a bit over 20 of our recommendations for this Fast 50 report, and so did a lot of the other contributors. Now, they were essentially recommendations, and then your team overlaid that with data to say, okay, look, you got hundreds of recommendations. Now, that had to be refined down to a list of 50, and I think majority of ours made that 50 because that's overlaid with quantitative and qualitative data to figure out, okay, well, does it fit the number of sales? Does it fit the number of actual properties transacted? And a number of other things that have to fit within there that we don't need to go through that. That whole, I guess that is contained within the report if people do want to download it. But
when they download
if they haven't already downloaded it.
You're mad if you're not. You haven't.
But I think to give some context to this, and I think
got 14.
14. See, 14 out of, I think we contributed 21. There we go.
Yep.
So a good 75 odd percent. But to give some context to listeners about what's happened in Australia before we go into this report. So I've got the most recent CoreLogic annual report in front of me, which basically is the financial year to June 24. To give some context as to what happened in all 500,000 transactions that happened and the context of the growth both in capital cities and regional centres. Looking at that data, Australia saw combined regionals saw 7% capital growth over the past 12 months. In the past 6 months, they saw about 3.4% capital growth, and the combined capital saw 8.3% growth over the past 12 months, and a touch above 4% over the last 6 months. So combined 8% even over the last 12 months. Annualised, and about 4% over the last 6 months. So between January 1st and June 30th, about 4% capital growth across all sales, and that includes houses and units. So effectively, that's what happened in Australia, which is actually a little bit above the long-term averages, which typically averages somewhere between 6 and 7%.
Yeah, which is it's reasonably healthy, right?
It's good going.
Yeah, if you get long-term, and this is the point around property as an asset class, the long-term averages are about that.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yep.
The best investors know they're not going to get that every year.
No.
Some years you can kill it and outperform it. Some years you're going to go backwards, right? But that's the long-term average around it. Reports like this, and if you're tactically looking to grow your portfolio and you're relatively new to investing, what normally happens is that someone buys, and I like to think so, a good investment property that's going to grow in value. They do that and they go, 6 months later, they go, well, what's next? Well, if you want to aggressively grow a portfolio, you need cash. And if you don't have cash, you need to manufacture cash through manufacturing equity, equity that you can pull out over time in order to provide deposits for building your portfolio. So essentially, you're borrowing 100% of your debt, right?
Yep.
And it's a moment in time as an investor. You're going to do this. I did this. You did this.
Yep.
I don't necessarily do this today. You know, I'm not redlining. I'm not accelerating at that sort of speed because I'm at a different phase of my portfolio. However, if you are new to investing or you're looking to, and that doesn't mean you're young, you know, you might be 50, 55, 60, right? Like, you know, people are still investing at those ages, having that realization of going, wow, I've got to retire soon. I better hurry up and do something, right? The skill is deploying your money so you get the greatest leverage from it as quickly as possible. And that, for the purpose of this report, is capital growth.
Correct.
Capital growth, assuming that you can meet the serviceability requirements of banks. Capital growth that you can turn into cash to buy another property and perpetually do it. And that's what compounding nature of property is. And you'll see it. Like, open up your social media feed. There'll be 1,000 people telling you about how to do this, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So how have we gone is the big question. How has the report fared? And we've taken a sample of your properties. And you know, you had a number of them made the list, a number of yours didn't make the list, a whole bunch of other people. And the report was everyone's got different investment strategies, right? Different people, different property-orientated people see the world differently. They might buy properties at different price points. You viewed it through the lens that you do the buying for your clients, and therefore you've come up with your recommendations. And they seem to be performing well. We'll get into that. Welcome back, Phil Tarrant. I'm chatting with Paul Glossop. He's the CEO, founder of Pure Property Investment. I've got some feedback for you, by the way.
Oh, okay. Here we go. Is it explicit?
Well,
General.
I think this goes to and for those of you who don't know Paul, is very transparent in his operations, and he enjoys secrets. So I'll give it to him live on air. They said, and you know this person, and they're a client of yours, and he's a policeman. That's the extent of what I'll go. And cops are interesting beasts, right? Because they're very insular and they talk a lot. They spend a lot of time together in cop
Bit
cars,
cagey.
talking stuff,
Yeah,
right? And he said to me, he goes, Paul's examples on his website don't seem to be current enough. They seem to be a bit old.
Yeah.
He said that just, he goes, something's, I know he's buying stuff really well at the moment, but the examples don't seem, they seem to be 6 or 12 months old.
Yep.
I don't know if that's fair feedback or not, but that's what he said to me.
That's actually an interesting observation because I'm actually doing a bit of a revamp of our website at the moment, and people will probably jump on Pure Property Investment and might look at it and straight away, and then they'll look at it and they're like, yep, he's correct. The challenge when it comes to sharing property, and that's probably an actually interesting
It's an issue, right? We spoke about this
and this
before.
is exactly it. And that, like, we're literally doing a podcast on sharing data over the last 6 months. Yeah. This is very quick. Like, looking at properties in the rearview mirror 6 months after purchase is, in my opinion, too quick. Now, we're doing this for the sake of saying, hey, we put a report out. Let's see how the report's performing. That's not necessarily saying that's the result of buying a property and that's a result of success or failure. But I think putting out, I guess the reason why we put properties on our website per se is probably just to give a general sense of what property types we've bought over the years. And we've been in existence for a decade, right? There's been a lot of property we've bought.
Going 12, 10 years.
10 years, right? In 10 years, you buy a property. We've bought in every single market except for the Northern Territory in that time. In some cases, multiple cycles over. But I guess that website it's a bit of an archive to say, here's what we bought back in this cycle.
Yeah.
Yes, the data is probably not accurate as far as how much it's probably grown because you can't give live feeds to property. It's static. It's a point in time. And if we're updating it every other week, then maybe we could make it current. But, I take that feedback because I'm almost reluctant to even say, is it worthwhile putting property on our website?
Well, this would be the point,
it's a waste of time.
Because, and this comes to what I was trying to articulate before we went to the break. You've got to be very, very, very careful as an investor. This is the property porn, right? It's the inspo.
Yeah.
Right. It's probably a better term.
Yeah,
This is the inspo. Like you go on social media and you're into fitness, you've got to see really, really fit people like spending all day telling you what they're going to eat and how many calories and clean eating and blah, 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 blah. That, like, it's going to come down a fire hose through you.
Yeah.
And you've got to get this picture of what you think perfect is, and you can achieve that, right? Like, that's what you're going to get, whether you're into cars or whatever your thing is, right? What you're going to get presented is the best of it, right? No one really is presenting the worst of it.
No.
And it's one thing I try and do with this podcast. I try and present the best and the worst, right? Like, so with property, you need to be very, very careful. And to the point around the website is that it's not, you just can't present perfect all the time because property investment is super strategic. It takes time, it takes energy, it takes really smart and solid execution, right? And we've spoken about this before. What you see on the social media will be the outliers.
Yeah.
Go to your website. What you get is what you should be expecting if you're a smart investor.
Our socials are
right?
basically the same as well. Like you'll probably see more current stuff in our socials because we try to be a bit more current there because you can post a bit more frequently.
Yeah.
But
it's not all about buying stuff under market value.
No, that
right?
terminology is very rarely used.
But that's what you get. That's the fitness inspo equivalent is, look at this, I got this for 30 grand cheaper than what the market is.
Instant equity.
Instant equity.
That term. Yeah.
The equity driver is investing in smart locations that you identify as being and having growth potential for the purpose of being able to utilize that equity growth, right? So that's the point. And hopefully people get that. I don't know if I'm articulating that well enough.
No, I think you are, mate. And I think it's a valid point because when we do jump into this data, and I guess going back to 8% over the last 12 months or 4% over the last 6 months in Australia, and we'll go into how those 14 recommendations that we had make the list, how they've performed over that time. You know, we might reflect back in 4, 5, 6 years and say, well, they're not necessarily seeing the same level of growth, but we might be in another market. And we might also say, well, you know, potentially if you're building out a portfolio, you're not necessarily focusing on saying I have one bullet in my chamber and I have to fire it accurately because I don't get a second shot. The intention here is that you're trying to say, okay, I want to get in there now with the intention that ideally in a shorter period of time than longer, I can extract that equity and then reinvest into the next market. I still want to hold that property for a 5, 10, 15-year cycle, and I need the cash flow to be good enough to allow me to do that.
Yeah.
But this isn't just saying I have one go at this and I hope it works, because if it doesn't, I'm in a world of bother. And that's probably a big part of what we always try to say is that, yes, we want to buy accurately and correctly and well, but this isn't just the only show. This is a multifaceted approach to long-term wealth creation.
There's one lens you can view it through. But what I'm doing, I've got a spreadsheet here in front of me with a whole bunch of information on it, and I like to do these things live and on the fly. My computer's having a meltdown. That's always really handy. Hang on a sec. What's going on here? Away. No. Yes. Oh, what's it? It's been hacked.
This is where it helps for anyone who's listening. You can listen to this in probably 2 times speed.
You can.
There's no elevator music that'll be added in.
Have you actually done that?
Oh, I'll do it all the time, especially when you're talking.
Yeah, 2 times.
Yeah.
You do 2 times.
I'll tell you a funny one for the listeners. Put Phil into 0.5 speed. I'll tell you what, you want to listen to a man who sounds like he's had 15 too many. That is Phil Tarrant at 0.5 speed.
No, I wouldn't say 15. I wouldn't say drinking beer, but it's I do have a bit of a drawl going on at half speed, but and I do like a perfect spreadsheet. By the way, I can't deal with something which is not formatted.
You get a bit of insight
correctly. Yeah, it's all about accuracy.
Right.
It's all about accuracy. But
Very cool.
All right. So the question I have for you, Paul, and I have in here my hot little hands.
Right.
So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. There's 14 suburbs here, locations. That made it into the Fast 50 for 2025. So where to put your money today for the best capital growth into 25. And I have next to it the actual growth rate year to date 2024. So from 1 January 2024 to 2 full quarters essentially. Okay. What do you reckon? So your point was average capital city, average annual growth for the last
12 months.
Sorry, the actual growth.
Actual growth.
Actual growth for the last 12 months was how much?
8% nationally for the last 12 months, about 4% over the last 6 months.
Okay, so 4% in the last 6 months. What I have data here is the last 6 months. Of the suburbs that you recommended that made the list, what do you reckon the average is? Average growth.
Over the last 6 months?
Yeah.
I'd have to say 12 to 14%.
The number is 14.33%.
Wowza.
So you're saying that nationally, 4 and a bit.
Yep.
You're at 14.
More than 3x'd.
3x times. So you've outperformed these suburbs. If you're recommending them, you've outperformed the market by 3 times. Simple language.
Not bad going.
It's okay.
It's okay.
I would have expected 4 times. This guy talked up as a really good report. I feel like I've been ripped off.
I tell you what, Phil, if I could show a report that showed me I beat the market 3 times, even over an annualised time frame, I'd be doing cartwheels. Now, it's a sensational result, if I'm honest with you. But it was, if I'm also going to, I mean, going back to the point of this report was talking about not 10 years, was talking about where to put your money in 2024 for the best results in 2025. So it was basically looking at a 12 to 24-month horizon. And this is one thing I love about property and property data is that it actually is really predictable. So if you want to try and find which areas are going to see a 2-3 year growth horizon, it actually isn't that complicated if you're only looking at that time frame. You can find areas which realistically are going to see mediocre growth. You can find areas which are going to be flat. But you can find areas relatively comfortably which you can see they're going to outperform the market. Yeah. Now, does that correlate to a 10-year outperforming the market? I would probably be comfortable to say this will revert to the mean at some stage over the next decade.
It'll have to, right? And you go through some of these suburbs and many of them didn't grow for 10 to 15 years. Some of them went backwards, right? You know, so it's a matter of timing and it's location selection. Time in the market, but timing the market, timing in this case, certain and you talk about 8% at a national annual level, 4% at the 6 month level.
We'll be over 20% average for this year.
We'll see how it plays out.
I'll put it on the line now to say we'll average over 20% in these suburbs over the 12 months.
So on that basis, and if annually it's 8% and this operates at 20, which call it sort of nearly 3 times, right?
Yep.
That means a lot of suburbs are going backwards or negative in order for that to wrap up. If you've got certain suburbs growing by 20%, 30%, some of them need to be growing negatively.
But it's all proportionate, right? And this is the thing about national data is that vast majority of the sales are occupied by New South Wales or let's be more specific, Sydney and Melbourne.
Yep.
They make up effectively almost half of the total sales volume. So if those markets are growing exponentially, you see the data will reflect that. If they're flat, it'll reflect that. If they're somewhere in between, it'll reflect that. The markets such as Perth, markets such as Queensland and Adelaide, whilst they might see boom and bust, and in this instance, majority of our selections were in Perth for this financial year or this calendar year rather, that's not going to affect the actual national data as much because ultimately the actual volumes of sales just don't reflect that same level. When you're talking about 500,000 sales, you're talking a good portion of those are happening in Sydney and Melbourne. So they dictate what happens to the national averages a lot more.
So if you look at that number, 8%, that means you've got a pretty strong market in Sydney, Melbourne.
Absolutely.
And naturally, Melbourne's been pretty humdrum, right?
Yeah,
as well.
Absolutely.
Sydney must be doing some heavy lifting.
Sydney's actually been, I've got that data in front of me here, but Sydney's been about 7%. I've got it actually sitting right here. And I'll give me a second. So Sydney, over the past year, dwelling values increased by 6.3%. So it actually wasn't that strong. In Melbourne, over the past year, values increased by 1.3%.
Yeah, I was going to say.
And then you look at, I'll give everyone a bit of around the grounds here. Brisbane over the last, and this is 12 months, increased by 15.8%. Adelaide 15.4%, Perth 23.6%. So you start to get a bit of a theme here that Sydney and Melbourne actually weighed down these averages. The other markets brought up these averages, and you start to see that that's where they sort of level themselves out. Which is also, that's a really interesting part that people really need to take into consideration when they're looking at average data as well. One thing I'll note here, and I probably, anyone who goes and downloads the report or has already downloaded the report, they'll probably look at, because the report doesn't just tell you the suburbs that are in the recommendations, it also tells you the average prices, and obviously, look, it's a little bit old now because it was 6 months ago and these prices have grown. But you'll see clearly that particularly our 14 recommendations that in the Perth market, and there was one in Queensland that also made the list, that they are actually all in the more affordable categories. When I say more affordable, they're not 200,000 or 300,000. They're typically somewhere between probably mid fours, or they were in mid fours, but let's say now probably $500,000 to $700,000 price points. The interesting thing about the CoreLogic data, and this is also something that was very predictable when we saw interest rates start to go on their upward trajectory in May 2022, was that you go through all these interest rate hikes and you go through this massive expense of actual holding costs. What do you expect to happen to where people focus their attention to buy property? Well, they effectively can't afford as much. So what it does is it corrals more people into the cheaper properties. And now, if you look through the core logic data, and this isn't just Perth, by the way, but if I look across all markets, the lowest 25% decile, or the lowest quarter of every market, every major capital city and every regional centre, except for Sydney, which was basically on par with the middle quarter, every single one of those markets, the lowest quarter performed the best when you look at percentage capital growth, which is also something to realise that when prices of cash become more expensive, people don't stop buying property. We still need it, and there's still a way to buy, but it pushes more people effectively either by their affordability or by their expectation of their cash flow to say, well, we can only buy what we can afford, as the adage goes. And that shows in this here. And you look back through COVID times in 2020, 2021, where money just went dirt cheap within a very short period of time. If anyone has a memory and looks at the data around the really exclusive parts of every major capital city, those really trophy homes, they went berserk for a period of time there, because people who had really big serviceability and could borrow their money at 2.5% realised that they could go and buy a $5, $10, $15 million property in certain instances with very little to have to worry about. But that's changed.
So most Australians, through necessity, need to buy more affordable properties purely because most Australians have lower to middle incomes.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
so there
the
needs to be
majority. You look at the average. Just essentially what the average household income is, and the combined incomes. Yeah, depending on what data you look at, I think it's combined average household income is about 120,000.
Yeah,
individual might be somewhere between 80 and 90.
It's about 90, 95, 97, I think.
Yeah,
median. I think it's a median.
Yeah, but then also now you factor in we've got some tax cuts, so that might mean that there's a bit more flush cash. That doesn't necessarily correlate to higher borrowing capacity, but yes, it ultimately means that's where their affordability goes.
Yeah, and it's important. It depends on where you sit in the spectrum of your relationship with real estate, and it's important to get out there every now and then. I had to drive up to Maitland the other week, and it was good for me to do it because it got me out of the city and pretty much said, Phil, this is what normal real estate is in Australia. Like, and if you haven't done that for a while, you should make the effort to go and do it. And, if you live in the capital cities and even if you live in inner city, even the outer cities, like you say Sydney, for example, if your frame of reference is Blacktown or the Ponds or whatever, like it's very, very different than where and how other people live in Australia.
Absolutely.
And many of the markets we sort of are inside the report probably aren't the typical. And you see tourists come into Australia all the time. They think Sydney is, Manly or the North Shore or, the eastern suburbs, Bondi Junction, like that. That's not representative of housing markets in Sydney and how Australians live, right?
It never has been.
It never has been, right?
No.
But that's what most people's view of it. And if you look on the television, that's probably what they'll tell you as well. So do yourself a favour. Get out and have a look at real estate and what it looks like and what affordable housing looks like. And to your point with this particular report and your recommendations, most of your recommendations are around affordable housing where your average Australian lives, right? And people have different views on that, saying, why would you invest in that sort of real estate? You should be investing in blue chip $1 million property. Well, that's only really available to the minority rather than the majority. Whereas if you're investing in property, the type of assets you're buying are going to be, through the very nature of how most property investors are, it's going to be affordable housing.
Yep. Yeah, and ultimately you're buying where the demand will always
where
exist.
it will be.
It will always exist. And don't get too caught up in the fact that, and we talk about this a lot over the years, is that you're not buying a property that you potentially are ever going to consider living in, or would I live here, or put any emotion into it. You've got to put the consideration of saying, is this a property in an area that's going to see consistent demand? Is supply going to be somewhat restricted over the long term? And is this a property that's going to appeal to the masses both now and in the future?
Renters or owner-occupiers.
Yeah, exactly. So i.e., is it going to be couples with children, downsizes, upsizes, etc.? You want to try and effectively try and target something that's got the biggest cohort in that area for a price you can afford with a cash flow that's not going to send you broke over a 10-year period.
So I've got here, I've just sorted these recommendations you made and what their actual growth is. And we said the average was 14.33, I think, by memory, 14.33%. The worst performer, interestingly, is the only Queensland property that you've recommended.
And what was that?
That's Marumba Downs in
And
North
the
Brisbane.
percentage growth over 6 months?
7.6%.
Which still
tracking twice
tracking double the national
twice
average.
the national average.
Yeah, and also is interestingly is probably one of the most expensive markets in our recommendations in there as well, as far as
I don't even know what price point. I don't even know where it was.
Marumba Downs it's not far from Kalanga, which you own property in North Brisbane there. But I dare say at this stage, I haven't got the exact data in front of me. It'd be close to 800 average price in that market for a freestanding house these days. So obviously that's probably at the higher end of where the recommendations for us were, and it's probably not a fluke, the fact that it's probably not performed as well as some of these other more affordable markets. Granted, they're in Perth, majority of them. And I probably also want to stress the fact that we did this review, and anyone who's on the podcast, they could probably go back to about 6 or 8 months ago when we did this same review, more a 12-month review for the previous report. That previous report that we put forward had a bit more of a blend for 12 months ago across WA and Queensland.
A lot more Queensland, a lot more South Australia.
Yeah. And
no Melbourne, I think, by memory.
Melbourne then.
A couple of Sydney. A couple of New South Wales.
But I think our recommendations specifically were across both the Brisbane market and I think we might have had one in the Adelaide market, and the majority of the rest was about a relatively even blend between Perth, Brisbane as well.
And a point that you made that South Australia, probably Adelaide, but it still performs really well.
It still has. It definitely has. And
just the gift that keeps giving that place.
It has. But it's not dissimilar to where Brisbane and also Perth sat for a long period of time. You go back to data, it only takes you to go look at probably 2014, 15 to about 2020. If you look at the performance in that time, there was basically nothing. You had a very, very sideways motion of period there. You had low demand as far as actual interstate and overseas migration demand. The economy was relatively sluggish, and also went through a period of too much supply, similar to where Perth was and also similar to where Brisbane was during that same cycle. And one thing that's interesting, Phil, probably just overlays all this with the supply component, is that this CoreLogic data that I've got in front of me on the annualized basis as well. We also look at things like the actual supply rates that are coming to market. And if we look at dwelling approvals, specifically dwelling approvals create obviously more property. Approvals aren't necessarily immediate though. It's not like you create an approval to build a dwelling and the next day it's there.
Yeah.
You're typically still a 12, 18, in some cases 36 months lag time. But dwelling approvals as of May 2024 are still tracking around 5 to 7% below long-term averages for both houses, and also probably more like 7 to 10% below the long-term averages for apartments. So it probably gives you some insight in the fact that, yes, whilst there are some approvals, they're not really trending upwards. If I look at the data, and I've got a long-term graph from about where I'm back to 1994, I'm looking at in front of me here to 20. So I'm looking at a 30-year graph. We're trending more or less sideways, and we're below the long-term averages right now. So if anyone's worried that there's going to be a glut of property that's going to come to any of these markets, not just Perth or Brisbane or any of these high-performing markets, you're going to think again. The way they change is slowly over time. There's not going to be a tap of property that's going to be turned on instantly overnight.
And again, that's the point, right? Like, these things take time. We're just looking at the outliers. These are the ones that are overperforming. And I've just done some quick analysis. I'll get into the suburbs specifically in a moment, and I'm happy that it's come up this way. And these are your recommendations. Yep. I'll probably need to do this at a whole of report level. But so I've got all of your recommendations in here, and then I've got those recommendations that actually made it into the report, right?
Yep.
And I said the average growth of each of them, 14.33%, right? Those properties that you recommended to go into the report, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So Beckenham in Perth, WA, 6107.
Didn't make the report.
Burpengary, North Brizzy, 4505. Dacabin, North Brizzy. Forestfield, WA, Medina Value.
Maida Vale.
Warner and that's in East Perth, 6057. Warner, North Brizzy, 4500. Their postcodes obviously in Woodbridge in East Perth, right? So you recommended them, and they didn't make the report, right?
For various reasons, they didn't make the cut on a couple of other
for whatever some of the other metrics, right? Guess what their average?
Higher?
Average,
Oh, no, it would have been lower, actually.
It's lower.
Lower. It would have been lower because, I mean...
And I'm happy because it just goes to show, like,
the
there's
validity
a bit of
in the
integrity
report.
in this,
yeah,
right?
Yeah, absolutely. Because, I mean, I can see straight away that that's dominated more by some markets in Brizzy, although they probably still would have averaged 6, 7, 8% 6-month growth.
Yeah.
I reckon you probably would have seen maybe 8 or 9% out of those alone. I don't know how you split that out, but I think they would have been... There certainly were less, particularly the North Brisbane properties.
Yeah, averaged at 12.3.
If the whole lot, all of our 22 odd recommendations.
No. So so the ones that made it,
Okay.
average
14.3.
growth 14.33.
The ones
That you
didn't
recommended and made it. The ones that you recommended that didn't make it,
Yeah, were
average
less.
of them was 12.3.
That's good.
Yeah,
Well, that's, it probably gives some validity to everything in there.
yeah,
As
it
well.
does.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and if you include all of your recommendations together, they grew at 13.65%. Right.
There you go.
So, but your recommendations, your Queensland property sort of dragged it down, right? The rest were in Perth. That was 14 point,
But I would
another
note
15%.
that again, like if you're getting 7% 6-month growth in any market, let alone in this report,
Any asset class,
any asset class, if you're getting 6-month growth or 10-year,
better than crypto.
yeah, if you've got to think this is leveraged as well.
Yeah.
If you're leveraging this at 4 times.
So you're controlling 15% of growth.
Yeah.
So that's what it is.
To give an example, if you're putting $100,000 or let's say $150,000 for a 20% deposit plus 5% for closing costs, you basically control a $600,000 asset. If a $600,000 asset costs you $150,000 to get into that, and that's annualized grows by 20%, hypothetically, you're talking $120,000, $130,000 in growth. That's almost probably 70, 80% cash on cash return over a 12-month period with rental returns.
Depending on your mortgage.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm doing that off a 20% deposit.
Yeah.
But I mean, I'm not assuming or suggesting that's what you should be doing, but I guess that's the power of leverage is probably that quick example there.
So I've ordered these. The ones that you recommended made the list.
Yep.
So we'll go through them. Let's go to a quick break. Stay with us back in a moment. Welcome back. Phil Tarrant, host of the Smart Property Investment Show. Paul Glossop, Pure Property Investment, our partner for the Fast 50 for 2025. Where to put your money today for the best capital growth for the year ahead. I wonder how many times I've said that. Who knows? Paul Glossop's probably going to do a Instagram post, which I know he loves to do. I don't know if you saw the Instagram post of when we did a podcast the other day when I did that live.
I did. When you called my...
What did your team say? Did they
Courtney was mortified.
Was she
Well, for
really?
2 reasons. A, she was on a lunch break, and B, it was her voice as far as the, I think, when it came to the actual holding and leave a message call as well, so she wasn't happy on all fronts.
Yeah, at least you got to say your phone number about 50 times. Some people will say
I think
that's
all I
really
remember
smart
is
marketing.
you saying 1-800 I'm desperate.
Is that-
I don't know that. And I pretty much said to everyone, I said, just give that number a call and you might be unfortunately surprised. Don't call that number.
This is probably oh, God. Anyway, what is your phone number again, by the way?
1-800-98-5428. It doesn't spell desperate.
It's 5:35. It's probably unfair to call it
Yeah, no,
today.
don't do that now.
But the point being, if people want to give you a yarn, I'm sure you can see it. I'll give you a hard time before saying this is you saying I told you so. Well, you sort of have.
Yeah.
To be fair.
Yeah, well, it's nice to be able to.
That's what people pay for, though.
Yeah, agreed. And I don't want people to expect this kind of growth on an annualised basis.
Yeah.
It's nice to get it.
It's a moment in time.
But we've got a lot of, we've bought an awful lot of property in the last 12 months, and I can almost unequivocally guarantee that a lot of that property, if not the majority of that property, wasn't in these areas. Now, just because you're not buying in these areas, though, doesn't mean you're missing out on growth either over the last 6 or 12 months. But also remembering that you're not buying for a 12-month or a 6-month result. A lot of markets we're buying in right now are nowhere near this report, and that's intentional.
That's important, and this is a really important question. Why wouldn't you, or when wouldn't you, invest in these places? Because most people go, well, you'd be mad not to invest in these because they're growing the fastest. When would you not do that?
Absolutely. And I get asked that question by some clients of mine who maybe are calling or have meetings and they're saying, well, I know these markets are booming and you guys are buying there, so
give me one of them.
Why aren't you recommending these markets? Well, there's a few reasons. A lot of the time, these people, I'll give you my own example, Phil. I own personally a fair bit of property in Perth, which I've bought over the last few years, and I particularly have bought that property for various reasons, predominantly for growth, a little bit for cash flow. Now, I'm looking to buy more property in my SMSF at the moment. Now, you'd think I'm just looking at data all day, every day, and I can see that these markets are growing close to probably north of 20% annualized. Why wouldn't I just keep loading up there? Well, I've got exposure there, and I'm not buying for a 12-month outcome, like I've just said. I'm not even buying for a 12-month or even 36-month outcome in a lot of stages. So I look at it and say, well, I've got some exposure there. I'm getting that growth as it comes to me now. Now, I kind of say, well, do I load up in a market that's now done 20% when I've already got 20% over the last 12 months, or do I load up in a market that I might have bought 2 years ago, maybe got 30 or 40% growth? There is some validity to say, look, I'll keep getting growth, but if I want to hold these next investments for maybe a 5 to 8 year cycle and I want to get in maybe more so at the ground floor, I'm happy to diversify, not into a different asset class. I'm not buying ETFs or crypto with it because I don't understand that. I understand property, but I also understand that there's markets which I know I don't personally have exposure in my portfolio to now that are probably at a better time in their cycle when I look at the next 5 years, 7 years, 10 years, and also asset types that I might not have now, whether that's for larger land sizes or for commercial cash flow or for maybe just bread and butter, 3-4 bedroom brick and tile homes.
Yeah.
That's when I'm looking at saying, yes, look, I get it. And sometimes it's a bit counterintuitive to think, why would I go elsewhere when the getting's good? But you have to be probably more focused on what is the overall strategy and the overall objectives.
And maybe this is an idea and probably should have a look at it. This report is where to put your money today for the best capital growth in the next year, right?
Yep.
A better report might be where to put your money today for the best consistent capital growth for the next 10 years.
Yeah.
It'd be very different suburbs.
It
Some
would
of them
be.
might.
People would have to hang on to this podcast for 10 years.
Imagine that.
you coming back 10 years down the track. Well,
With
Paul
my- with my
and I
Zimmer
put
frame.
together this report 2024.
Paul told you so.
Yeah, for those of you who are still around.
He told you so.
I don't think it's going to...
But you know what I mean? Like, it'd be hard to measure it, but to actually say, and that's how I invest. Like, I'm not buying, and I probably should do, to be fair, just because I can, to buy some of this stuff. I've had stuff like this in my portfolio before, right? It's been good.
Yeah.
So I probably should.
And it has got you to where you are from a property standpoint.
Of course. I'm more of a where to put my money today for the best compounding average annual growth for the next 40 years.
Yeah, I know. And that's tough, right?
But you've got to do this before you do that.
You're correct, and that's it. Like, and ideally, you're doing both. You're doing this short-term stuff to try and get more rapid upsticks, and then you're trying to say, okay, how do I cleave off a bit of that growth to put it into longer-term stuff? But it doesn't mean, sometimes it's fool's gold. You know, you talked about that too.
A lot of this is fool's gold.
A lot of the other stuff is fool's gold. So you can't get too sidetracked to say, I'll just buy the cheap $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 stuff and I'll forego the bigger stuff. But a lot of people just can't. And what we talked about earlier, the affordability component, the serviceability component, the cash flow component, a lot of people just can't do it. But that doesn't mean you can't build a meaningful, large portfolio that's going to really further your retirement beyond just what you're doing in your super.
And that is the point. If you want to be that person to grow a long-term sustainable portfolio, you need to start somewhere. Most Australian investors own between 1 and 2 properties because often, and most of the time, they buy the wrong properties first. So what this report is give you some clues. If you want to be that person, you can start here with a 20, 30, 40-year horizon, right? If you're like in your 30s, you know, you've probably got another at least 3 decades of work ahead of you, right? Yep. Like if you take a long-term view with this and go, this stuff might and will work for me right now as an accelerator. These are accelerators, right? And what you want to do is that you want to, and I hate the term, you want to hack the system as effectively as possible to get the growth that you need when you need it. Typically, that for most people, that's at the start of their property investment journey. You want to maximize capital growth when you don't have any real serviceability issues. Like you're going to be able to get, most people on an average salary, you're probably going to be able to, with reasonable cash flow, and I'm generalizing here.
Yeah.
You probably talk better this because you see in your client base, you're probably going to get 2 to 3 properties before the bank goes, no more money from you.
Yeah,
no more money for you.
Depending on the price of the assets.
I'm generalising, right?
Double income, single income, but you probably bang on, Phil. Like most people can get to the point, if they don't have an owner-occupier already with a large debt against it, if you're starting and sort of have a mindset to maybe say, I rent best to start with, 2 or 3 assets is more or less going to be comfortable. Now, that's on the serviceability standpoint, but to your point, Phil, like you've got to say, well, there's always these 2 major levers when you're building a portfolio. Serviceability, which is a direct result of your income, and then actual deposits, which comes in typically either a form of cash or equity, which can be your equity or it can be a guarantor from someone else. But they're the two things which don't actually work in unison either. Just because you have huge serviceability, you may be strapped for cash and vice versa. I work with a lot of people who have an owner-occupier that might be worth $2 million, but they have $1 million debt against it and they earn, say, $250,000 as a household, but they're potentially very, very strapped on how they can access serviceability. Equity is not the problem, but it's how to get the cash out and also serviceability. So I guess we talk about asset selection here, but having a good broker, and you talk about hacking the system, every great property investor I know don't have a huge income in common. They have typically good asset selection in common and a great broker in common. They're the two things that I find more often than not is a commonality.
They're your key strategic levers that you've got to pull, right, to get it right. You've got to choose the right properties and you've got to have a good person to help you get the dough out of it. So let's talk about some specifics. So we spoke about Marumba Downs, 7.6% and that grew over 6 months.
Over 6 months.
I reckon anyone would go, yeah, thank you.
I'd say
Please, sir.
May I have another?
Yeah. Wattle Grove.
Yep.
6107 in WA. That's southeast Perth. 11.4% 6 months. This is the median growth, correct?
Correct, yeah. But you're not talking a huge amount of sales, and you're talking all houses, right? So you could basically say if you bought 6 months ago to the day, you probably would have seen somewhere around about this.
Okay, let's translate that into something, and you're on your pocket computer there trying to work something out. But in Wattle Grove, in southeast, so I can imagine where southeast Perth is. Never been to Wattle Grove. Didn't even know it existed until I saw this report, right? It's grown over 6 months at 11.4%. So you can assume, and you probably said it, annualised sort of growth in Perth, and the stuff you've picked about 20%, right? What are you buying in Wattle Grove? Are they, what is it, 1990s brick 3-bedroom, 2 bathrooms?
80s, 90s, sort of 600 to 800 square metre blocks. A lot of them in that area potentially also are on large enough with enough site access to maybe consider subdivision as well. They have zoning that might allow for R20, R60, R30, something that allows for future higher density.
What's that?
The equivalent of like basically, let's say New South Wales money, you're talking equivalent of R2 zoning.
Okay.
Maybe even up to R3 zoning. Yeah, correct.
Or a duplex or a townhouse development.
Yeah, correct. But not that that's why we're buying, but you're buying a land component that becomes valuable in an infill location.
What would a property that you're talking about and you're buying in Wattle Grove, what would have it been worth? Say you settled on the 1st of January. How much would that be?
Oh, then it would have been maybe 600,000.
Okay. So 600 odd grand. Simple numbers. And it's grown by 11% in
6 months.
So you've made yourself 60 and a 60-bit $1,000 with some change in equity growth.
In equity growth, not in actual dollar value, or sorry, in dollar growth, because obviously you can't extract all of that growth that comes from it.
Yeah. The issue you would have though is there's a couple there. So you've manufactured, and we're talking generally, you manufactured yourself 60 grand in equity in 6 months' time, right? If you settled that on the 1st of January 2024, and at the 30th of June 2024, you went to your bank and said, I want to get my 60 grand out of it, the likelihood of a bank valuing that at that percentage point higher than what you actually purchased it for, I reckon there'd be a gap.
I'd agree with you.
And this is a core point, right? Like it sounds good on paper, but practically sometimes you got to wait. And
I think always, I mean, have the mindset when you're buying property, if you get this result on paper, don't think that it's accessible today, because banks are pragmatic and valuers are pragmatic, and they look at anomalies, and they also say, hey, look, just because the data's showing it's grown by this much, that doesn't mean that we're going to give you it all. And they typically have policies to say, unless you're going to a different bank, if you're going back to your same bank, and this is probably a word to the wise to speak to your broker about this, if you want to get a somewhat aggressive, you might be able to find valuations with banks that you're not currently with to get higher valuations. And I can think of countless scenarios that play out like that, where you have to be creative to hack the system, to use your term, Phil. But usually you got to say 12 months is your minimum time horizon to even worry about discussing extracting equity if you're going to stay with the same bank. So that's something that probably you need to consider. And for there, it's for obvious reasons, is that markets need to mature, they need to go through their cycles. And Perth will do its cycle just like every other market does over time. And we'll look, the one thing I'd probably note with a market that does 10, 15% 6 month growth, is that won't turn to zero in the next 6 months. So there usually is a pretty strong inertia. Yeah. That inertia doesn't just work in growth, though, by the way. That inertia works in markets.
So it's not going to be
dormant.
sawtooth like this.
No.
It's got to sort of be sort of
and when
soft
markets
roller
soften,
coaster.
they slow right down. But when markets slow down as well, you've got to remember that they don't just all of a sudden go through a boom. That doesn't happen overnight. You start to see signs of lack of supply. You start to see long-term sort of 1, 2, 3 year vacancy rate data start to drop down. You start to see supply and approvals start to become way below the long-term averages. You start to see economics changes. So you've got to look at those things to actually give you keys not only for growth but also for slowing down.
So the point is, just because it's grown by 11.4%, this is Wattle Grove, in 6 months' time, don't mean you're going to be able to get that money.
No.
So for people that want to aggressively grow their portfolio, you're not going to buy refinance in the space of get 3 properties in a year. Unless you've got to inject exterior funds. You can't do that solely through refinancing and accessing equity. I don't know if that's possible. Maybe if you're really smart and you've got
got to be you also got to have a proactive broker who's also potentially, and this is
it's got to be conflicted.
Well, this is it, right? Like, and for anyone who's sort of wondering what Phil means by saying they're going to be conflicted, is that usually if you've got, let's say hypothetically, you bought that property in Wattle Grove for $600,000. And you took a loan with CBA, and you come 6 months later, you're like, you know what, I've got enough equity in this to maybe extract something out and go again and keep that property. Your broker who's written that loan will potentially look at it and say, well, if I write that away and I go find ANZ as an example is going to give me a valuation of even more. Let's say they give me a valuation of $700,000, and that's a fantastic valuation. If they take this loan away from CBA, there's a chance that broker might actually get a clawback on the loan that they've written. Now, what that means is that potentially they lose all of the commission that they actually wrote. Now, is that in the best interest of the client? Well, it's debatable, because sometimes broker's job is not just to figure out how to get the best interest rate, but they're also best duty practice. They have requirements to figure out, is this the best thing for you? Yes, there's growth there, but sometimes consolidating for another 6 months, 12 months, building up your buffers, making sure your cash flow is okay is also going to be more pragmatic. So it's not just get the equity out as quick as you can.
I'd love to speak to a broker about that, because brokers are obliged under the codes of conduct. I'll use simple language. The codes of conduct that they operate within to always act in the best interest of the borrower, not for themselves.
No.
Now,
absolutely.
if your broker flatly goes, no, I'm not going to do that because I'm going to lose all my commission, they're probably the wrong broker for you.
I would absolutely agree.
If that's the response you get, you're with the wrong broker. If your broker says, okay, let's have a look at this. Let's work out whether or not it's appropriate for you right now and how that's going to help accelerate you. That's what a good broker would do. Irrespective if they lose the commission or not, they should do the right thing for you.
Completely.
They should absolutely do that.
And ask your broker that question too. I mean, word to the wise, anyone out there who's listening to this, maybe it's worthwhile. If you've got any properties that you think are sitting in that position, test your broker out, and maybe not in a cynical way to say, I'm going to see if they're worth their...
Let me try and trick them.
Yeah. But it's worth asking the question and see what their response comes back.
And I don't want to get beaten up by brokers. I like brokers. Brokers are great.
But I
invest
have
in the brokerage business.
Phil, you and I have also, I guess it's a little bit sidetracked, but I have an open dialogue with my broker. And I know the property game and the finance game well enough to know when a property or a loan was written and if I refinance it away, if they're going to lose commission or not. And I have a relationship in the sense that I can talk about it in a way, but they also know that I'm going to be a very, very good client for them long term. And that doesn't mean that I'm just worrying about this deal per se. I'm worrying about their best practice or their best outcome rather, because I know that I'm not looking at them as my meal ticket. I'm looking at the outcome for them, which then leads to them telling everyone they know that, hey, this person is going to really do the best thing by you. So that's why I'm working with them.
But realistically, structurally, practically, even if you try and refinance from another lender, they're going to know what you paid for it.
Yeah.
All the data's there. And then you're not going to get stupid valuations quickly, right? It's hard. What smart people do, and this is probably more of a you thing, is that they might refinance their principal place of residence and they get a pool of funds, equity, which has been turned into liquid cash.
Yep.
They don't use all of that into one property.
No.
They'll use
Sparing.
that to maybe 2 or 3, right?
Yep.
And that's how, then you can get this accelerated growth. So you're using equity to grow your portfolio quickly rather than going buy, hold, quickly refinance, buy, hold, quickly refinance. That takes time. But if you can extract a larger amount of equity, most people do it through their principal place of residence, that's going to allow you to potentially do 1, 2, 3 straight off the back And by the time you get that, the first property might be 18 months on, 2 years on.
Yeah.
And then you can start looking at it again. That's what works. You've got to be patient with this stuff.
Yeah, you've got to be patient with what you buy. Be really sparing with what you have, and I think that's you raised the point there, Phil. Is that LMI, Lenders Mortgage Insurance, is something that I personally I'm always I'm even keel on, because there's certain times it makes a lot of sense. Other times I'm not. And you explained in your portfolio, Phil, you're far less aggressive now than years ago when you had a certain wedge of cash. And to kick off, you knew full well that you say, hey, I've got this cash to work with, which was essentially your float, your starting, your seed money. But once you get rid of that, to then get that, most people just don't have the next tranche of cash ready to go. So you kind of say, okay, there's two ways. I can use a 20% deposit and be really a relatively low LVR and make sure the property is going to be really comfortable, etc. But I can only buy one. Yeah. Or I can say I can take that level of cash. I can run a much finer margin, knowing that I've got a longer career ahead of me. I've got income that I'll earn. I'm also confident the fact that I'm not buying for a 5-year or even a 2-year or 1-year cycle. I'm buying for a 5, 10, 15, 20-year cycle. So I'm going to use that cash, split it into much smaller deposits, pay Lenders Mortgage Insurance, capitalise it onto the loan, be comfortable knowing that I've got a higher debt-to-income ratio, but I know I've got a longer-term horizon. I'm controlling a much bigger pool of cash. That's really what people need to think about, and what their brokers should be explaining both sides of that ledger. And you and I have started out that way a long time ago.
You might have used my original broker was Ross LeKay.
Yep. Ross is a client of mine.
Yeah, is he a client of yours?
Yeah, actually, funnily enough, speaking of Thornley, I'm pretty sure we might have bought property there or thereabouts a couple of years ago.
So he was Australia's #1 broker. Mm-hmm. Now he's a coach of brokers, a billion-dollar-broker.com.au. I'm sure he'd be happy if I sort of mentioned that. But
one of the better ones.
One of the he's really, really good broker. Yep. And the smart property investment portfolio, which we speak about, sort of it's a decade old now, thereabouts. We grew that from 0 to 17 or 18 properties in about, call it 5 years, 6 years, right? Worth, I think at its peak, maybe $10 million bucks, somewhere or other, maybe $12 million bucks. I can't remember the number exactly. In order to create that portfolio, we started with a couple of $100,000, but it wasn't like straight away a couple of $100,000. It was incrementally. So when we started buying, we put cash in.
Yep.
It wasn't refinanced dough; it was cash to about 200, 250 grand, whatever. And that was the seed dough that got into it. And then after a point in time, we started refinancing and leveraging the equity, right? Because, once you get 10 properties, you start back here. Some of them we refinanced a couple of times, right?
Yeah.
We still have those properties. But that original money, we took it back out.
Yeah. And then
so that portfolio was built, essentially, inverted commas, with no money down.
Well, that's it. And that's the holy grail.
Yeah. And you might go, $200,000, geez, it doesn't go far these days. You're going to get one and a bit properties with that these days. So it's only 10 years ago.
But that's one and a bit if you worked off a 20% margin. Yeah.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. So you can still do that. The numbers are a bit different.
Yeah.
But you can still do it. The same principle applies,
Absolutely
right?
Absolutely they do.
So conserve your dough, deploy it properly, and hence the reason why, where to put your money today for best capital growth, right? If you've got a refinance lump sum of dough out of your principal place of residence, don't put it all on black or don't put it all on red. No. Maybe sort of park it around. It's not gambling. It's probably the wrong analogy, but use that strategically to deploy into these areas so you can get that capital growth. And at a point in time, you can get that benefits of extracting the equity and redeploying it elsewhere. So just because Wattle Grove has grown at 11.4%, which might mean about 60-something thousand bucks, you're not going to be able to get your hands on that quickly.
No. And that's not the intention, right?
That's not the intention. No. So just a sense of caution there. But Beachborough, northeast Perth. I don't even know who Beachborough.
Yep.
Sounds like a made-up name. 30% growth in 6 months. I shouldn't get a job as a advisor.
You probably should.
I probably should. Caversham, northeast Perth, 6055. Great place. Caversham Tavern. Probably sounds like
my first beer at Caversham Tavern.
I reckon there is a Caversham Tavern. Again, 13% growth. Brabham, northeast.
Sir Jack
Perth.
Brabham.
Sir Jack
Not named
Brabham.
after
Is it
him.
named after him?
No.
Jackie Brown, one of the great Formula
great-
One drivers.
yes.
I went to the Formula One this year.
I know you did. That's
I've
when
already
you,
been
that's when you
invited.
know people have changed.
I've already been invited.
We didn't invite me.
I've already been invited to go again next year in the Ferrari area,
I'll still wait
whatever
for the
that's
invite.
called.
I'm waiting. This is me waiting.
I did go and watch that, well, at least two episodes of that
Drive to
Survive. And
It
I
was
sort
the
of went,
original.
I went,
It was good at the time, I
yeah,
think. Yeah.
I sort of get it,
Yeah.
you know, but it's only so much corporate hospitality you can do.
It's all the same. Once you fly first class, it's all the same.
It's all the same. It's all the same. I don't do a lot
I
of
wouldn't
corporate
know, by the
hospitality these
way.
days. Bradman, that's in Perth, 13.3%. Butler, North Perth, 6036, 14.1% growth. Baldivis.
There you go.
That's what does that even mean? Like, where do they come up with these names?
Well, what does Philip mean?
Philip means lover of horses.
You've been waiting for that, haven't you?
I don't even know how I know that. What's Paul mean?
I can't help you there. That's what it means.
Probably. Paul from people I can't help you there. Ellenbrook, northeast Perth again, 6069, 14.6% growth. Thornley, 15.3% growth. Huntingdale, southeast, both of them southeast Perth. That's 6108 and 6110, right next door largely. 15.6%. Lakelands, South Perth, 16%. Kelmscott, 6011, 17.3. I reckon your team just went, look, you know, we found one. Let's just draw a circle around it and include all of them. It's going to be close enough. Medina,
Yep.
17.4%, and Balga, 17.9%, rounded up to 18%.
I'll give a common theme here, and anyone who wants to jump onto Google Maps and look at those suburbs right now, you'll probably see pretty quickly and clearly that the slightly above average or above Perth or these markets that we talked about, even the high level of growth, or some of those are obscenely high, and some of these markets that were bought in are on track for well over 30%. 12-month growth.
How does that happen? Like,
Well, this
this
isn't the first year of it, Phil. This is the second year. So in some cases, I can tell you that some of these markets we bought 3 years ago, and we've seen already a doubling in value. Already, we're actually in a point where some clients are already exiting because they've taken enough out of it and they're going elsewhere.
Redeploying it somewhere
They're
else.
redeploying. They're saying, look, because they're all of a sudden they're hamstrung on their serviceability. Like, I've got enough in that. That's done 15 years worth of growth.
So this, to my point around, why wouldn't you invest in these places? Well, probably those people.
Well,
they got in there early enough and they're putting somewhere
and
else.
also, they've got enough exposure. But I guess the south, the Mandurah, Rockingham, down the coastline, it has in the last 12 months probably done slightly above the Perth metro or the Perth proper. Not because it was probably a little bit more undervalued at a point in time, and you still get an earshot straight to Perth. You're still on a train line, still on a highway access, and you're still in some cases less than an hour away from Perth CBD, but you're in some cases less than a K to the beach.
Yeah.
And you're buying a freestanding house, in some cases really nice, or a big block of land for $500,000. It was undervalued at a point in time, and it probably still is going to be seeing more growth. But that's probably one observation out of this. But is that going to transpire to the next 12 months? Yeah, it's still, if you're getting 10, 12% 6-month growth or even annual growth, you're still going to be very, very happy. Because one thing that we don't talk about and we haven't talked about in this report or today is that most of these markets are actually still about 5% yield.
Yeah, it's cash flow.
That's a very important point to bring up here, Phil, is that you can
that helps with cash flow, helps with serviceability.
With equity extraction. If you want to hold the property, you say, I could take equity out, but you're still actually holding a decent yielding property. And you try to find that equivalent elsewhere, they kind of still don't exist.
How many people actually refinance properties on the basis of, like, it could be positively geared? They'll go, I'll refinance it to a degree where it's neutrally geared and I'll take the gap.
In this market, not many.
No. Okay.
Because, you rewind 3 years ago, plenty.
Yeah.
But the cash rate today,
So high.
it's not. And that's why people sort of are a little bit reluctant to extract equity right to the top end. It's not because they don't want to use it, but they also know that, hey, that's going to mean obviously a significant higher repayment position.
And that's an important point, because if you extract the equity, that might be fine. It means that you're going to have a bigger mortgage on that asset. If you can cover that, fine. If the cash flow allows it, so it's still a neutrally orientated investment, that's fine. However, for you to deploy that equity, you're going to have to get another home loan.
Yes.
which means that your life's going to get a lot more expensive.
Yeah, correct. And I'll probably overlay this with something else though. And you know, I know we're going through a lot of data here, but it's really handy because I've sort of brought up this national 12-month core logic data, which I've got a whole bunch of information in front of me that we look at. But if I look at average change in rental rates for the 12 months to June 24, and I look at all the major capitals and I look at the percentage of what's grown in value, this actually gives you some flavour as to why certain areas we recommend and we're comfortable with. If I go through them, Canberra 2.5% annual rental growth, Darwin 3.1%, Hobart 2%. If I look at Sydney 7.9%, Melbourne 8.5%, it's growing and it's growing pretty significantly. Brisbane 8%, Adelaide 8.5%, Perth 13.2%. So when you start to say, okay, well, yeah, great, the market's grown, I can't extract equity. Well, yes, money's got more expensive, but you've actually seen this rental market really increase. So it actually is giving a bit of buttress to anyone who wants to take cash out, and actually they're seeing their incomes increase as well. So it actually is allowing people to be a little bit more aggressive. Now, yeah, these numbers, you can't see those numbers repeat year on year, but you are seeing that rent's really strong. Vacancy rate's still well below 1%. Actual supply, and when I look at other things, and I've got so much data that we look at in front of me right here, but if I actually look at lending as far as how much lending's going to investors, because remembering that supply is not just created by properties being built, but an owner-occupier property being sold to an investor creates a rental property. So you've also got to remember that's how rental property and supply is created in the rental market. But if I look at property actual lending for investors only across the country, and I look at it versus its long-term averages, New South Wales currently 41%. At its peak back in 2014, it was at almost 55%. Victoria is at 32%. At its peak, it was about 45%. Queensland's 39%. At its peak, it was at about 41%. South Australia is at 37%. At its peak, it was about 44%. WA is at 36%. At its peak, it was about 39%. Tasmania is about 28%, and its peak was about 33%. What I'm trying to say there is there's a flavour that we're still not actually
flavour. You've used flavour a lot. Tell me the flavour. What's that movie?
What's your flavour?
It's like the vibe. Well, what's the movie? It's
Marbo.
It's the vibe. It's the vibe.
Are you
man.
talking about The Castle?
Yeah, maybe it's something. It's something about. It's like the vibe, man. It's like the flavour. but the flavour of this. So I sit there and I go, 20%, 30% growth,
13% rental growth. Yeah,
but I go something growing for 3 years in a row at 20%, right? I go, and most property detractors would go, nah, it's a bubble.
Yeah, and they might have said that in the first year as well. But you also might say that, and I do get a lot of detraction, and I'm not going to suggest that everyone who contacts us, we're going to put them into a property in Perth, because it depends. But I can also, what I opened with when we were doing this review is that we're not necessarily buying a heck of a lot more property in these markets necessarily, unless it's really, really required. There are other markets which are earlier. And when I say earlier, they might be 3, 4, 5 years off this really fever pitch moment, but you can get in there at a discount. And Perth, we were buying in Perth. Believe it or not, Phil, we started buying there in 2019.
Yeah. I know that some of the smarter buyers agents were out there sniffing around before, just before COVID.
And you had to be patient then, right?
Yeah, you had to be patient. And I remember also chatting with Damien Collins, who is
based over there,
managing director of
Momentum
Wealth. Yep. And he's also got a fund and stuff now, but he was on the board of Pippa for some time. I think he was the chair of the Real Estate Institute of Western Australia. Yep. And I remember chatting to him in 19, also 20s, and he's like going, it's brewing.
It's happening. It's early.
It's early. It's early. And not just yet, but soon.
And that's it, right? Like some people, if you looked at the data in 2019 in Perth and someone was saying, hey, we should buy here, I could show you 10-year data and you say, you are absolutely out of your mind. But why would I buy in a market that's gone backwards 25% and is not showing any signs of growth? Maybe it's about a 4 or 5% yield. Are you kidding me that that's where I want to put $400,000 or $500,000 when I can see Brisbane doing this, Sydney doing this, even Melbourne doing this at the time? You saw Hobart doing other things. Now,
everyone's in Queensland.
Everyone's in Queensland. I mean, we were buying back in Hobart and certain parts of WA. We're buying bits of Adelaide then as well. Yeah. But you've got to have a strong reason, but B, you've got to have a bit of courage and patience. because you're not buying now for 20% growth necessarily. Yeah, you can go and target it and get in there straight away, and you might get another 20-30% out of this. But there are other markets which are Perth 2019 now. They exist.
So what I don't understand, and I'm a pretty simple bloke, and most people would agree with that, is that
I would.
Many thousands of people have downloaded this report, right?
Yep.
But if I was investing in property, 8% of all Australians claim some sort of deduction, right? There's a big cohort of people invest in property. I would expect that if there was a report that pretty much telegraphed what to do,
2 years running,
and it was for free, and it was that there would be hundreds of thousands of people who've gone, here's a clue.
I look at you, Phil, and say maybe you haven't spread the word as good as you maybe can.
I don't know what I'm supposed to do. I think every single buyer's agent in the land's heard me. There you go. I think you're probably fighting to get off the plane, right? You can't get a business class flight to Perth these days.
Business class flights. Geez, you live a good life, don't you?
Me?
Far out.
Yeah, no, mate. It's anyway. I'm still waiting for the Lord Mayor of Perth to give me a call and say, Phil, thanks for being the greatest supporter for Perth. Yeah.
I'm pretty sure I did a Channel 9 special there maybe in 2021, believe it or not. And I remember sitting on the 6 o'clock news, and I expected the same thing, Phil. I expected someone to
Probably
give me the
hated
keys
you,
to the
did they?
city. I actually, funnily enough, I'll tell you this for free, is that I actually had a lot of real estate agents be very, very chummy with me after that.
Or do they call you up?
Well, when we did call them and we referred to that, they're happy because they lived a very meagre life for a good.
Horrible.
They were struggling for a good 8 or 9 years, and they thought, oh, hang on, here's someone propping up the market, and we're like, the market wasn't booming then, but we could see again the green shoots. What you said about Damien Collins as well.
Yeah, nice one. All right, well, thanks, Paul. So smartpropertyinvestment.com.au. If you haven't yet downloaded this, it's still available. You just click on the Fast 50 button. You'll be able to track it down. You can even get the 24 report there as well.
Absolutely.
If that's what you want, you can do your homework and cross-reference it. But the top investment suburbs in 2025, that's where you need to go. Pretty easy. Go and find it, download it, check it out, and you can send your scorecard back. And maybe I'd like to see some – I'd actually like, and if you're tuning into it, get in touch with the team editor at smartpropertyinvestment.com.au. Anyone who has actually used this to actually make decisions, and I know there's many of you just going, and you don't have to thank me. I don't really care.
You can thank me.
You can thank Paul. I had nothing to do with this. It's all these other people that know a lot more about property. But Pure Property, if you want to have a chat with them, give them a call. What's your
purepropertyinvestment.com or 1-800-985428.
You need an easier phone number with a jingle. You need a jingle.
You gave a jingle. 1-800 I'm desperate. It's not 1-800. It's 1300. 1300 9854. You confused me with the 1-800 I'm desperate. It's 1300 985428, not 1-800 I'm desperate.
All right, apologise to your colleague Courtney. Courtney's there standing. She's a good operator, Courtney.
She is a good operator.
She and your team as well, which we've spoken to. But you go and check it out, smartpropertyinvestment.com.au. It's Paul Glossop from Pure Property Investment. Thanks for tuning in. A bit of a long one, but a bit of detail. It's all good. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you again next time. Until then, bye-bye.
The information featured in this podcast is general in nature and does not take into consideration your financial situation or individual needs and should not be relied upon. Before making any investment, insurance, tax, property or financial planning decision, you should consult a licensed professional who can advise whether your decision is appropriate for you. Guests appearing on this podcast may have a commercial relationship with the companies mentioned.